In Aristotelian logic, in order for an argument to be valid, it must follow a certain structure, and that structure is the structure of logic. It is the structure of validity. And I can illustrate it with the following example. This is the first premise. People with a mental illness suffer. The second premise is, I have a mental illness, and the conclusion is, I suffer. Now, this argument follows a very simple structure, and that structure is if P, then Q. So as you can see, I'm asserting if P, then Q by saying in my second premise, I have a mental illness, and then concluding that I therefore suffer. This is how logic works. This is how logic works in terms of validity, and so this is a valid argument. Now, while the logic is important, especially as I want to link logic with mental illness, what I'm more concerned with in this specific instance is the way in which logic has allowed me to create a very concise statement, a very specific statement, and one that has a lot of power. I don't say much, and yet, in terms of words, and yet, because I use the logical form, I end up saying a lot. Now, let's try another example. This one in where we can go more in depth. This is the first premise. People with a mental illness are illogical and irrational. The second premise is, I am logical and rational. And the conclusion, which you will see is invalid, is I have a mental illness. Now, this is an interesting example to use because it doesn't follow, and it is an invalid statement, and yet I nonetheless have a mental illness. And this is what I want to draw attention to. I want to draw attention to the way that logic starts to break down whenever we bring in certain notions of mental illness and what we expect from mental illness. So usually we would say that a person with a mental illness is illogical and irrational, but we don't really think about what that means. And this statement is an example. In order for this statement, for this specific argument to be valid, I would have had to conclude by saying I don't have a mental illness. But in my history, I have been diagnosed with a mental illness. And yet I'm a very logical and rational person. And even though that would have been a valid argument to say I don't have a mental illness, it wouldn't have been a true statement. And that is the interesting way in which these arguments start to break down, by linking logic with irrationality and thinking through the logical form and thinking through our expectations and stereotypes of mental illness and what that means. So even though this is pretty heavy in terms of thinking about these statements, if P then Q, or if not P then not Q, and even though it's very specific in terms of, like I said, the logical form and the logic itself and the argument itself, and thinking very specifically about Aristotelian logic, it nonetheless conveys a lot of very interesting statements. I have deconstructed logic as we expect it and deconstructed mental illness as we would normally expect it, and used the logical form to essentially subvert what we expect out of mental illness. I hope you enjoyed this little talk and found it meaningful. Again, this is Phoenix, and thank you.